The moment a stranger asked me when I planned to sign the final sale papers for my land, I realized someone had been making decisions about my future behind my back. My name is Evelyn Carter, and until that Tuesday morning, I believed there were still a few people in this world I could trust without question. One of them was my father. I was sitting at my kitchen table in Lincoln, Nebraska, going through emails before work. The coffee beside me had already gone cold because I was distracted by a long list of invoices and deadlines. It was an ordinary day, the kind of day you forget almost as soon as it ends. Then my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. Normally I would have let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. "Hello, this is Evelyn." The woman on the other end sounded cheerful and professional. "Good morning, Miss Carter. I'm just calling to confirm whether you'll be attending the closing in person or remotely next Friday." I frowned. "I'm sorry, the closing for what?" There was a brief pause. "The land sale, of course." I laughed nervously because I genuinely thought she had called the wrong person. "I think there's been a mistake." Another pause, longer this time. "You are Evelyn Carter, owner of the property outside Dawson County?" My stomach tightened. "Yes." "Then I'm confused," she said carefully. "We were informed everything had already been approved and that the transaction was moving forward." I remember staring out the kitchen window at the backyard while my mind tried to catch up with what I was hearing. Transaction. Approved. Moving forward. None of those words made sense. I had never listed my land for sale. I had never spoken to a buyer. I had never signed a single document. The woman sounded concerned now. "Miss Carter, are you saying you were unaware of the sale?" My heart began pounding. "I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about." The conversation lasted only a few more minutes. She apologized and promised to review the file. I thanked her, hung up, and sat completely still. The silence in the house felt different after that. Heavier, almost threatening. The property she mentioned wasn't just any piece of land. It was 160 acres that had belonged to my grandmother. Rolling fields, old oak trees, and a small creek that cut through the northern edge. Some of my earliest memories live there. Summer afternoons, chasing fireflies. Fishing with my cousins, listening to my grandmother tell stories on the porch while the sun disappeared behind the horizon. When she passed away 8 years earlier, she left the land to me. Not because I was the oldest grandchild, not because I needed the money. She said I was the only one who understood what it meant to her. Since then, I had protected it carefully. I paid the taxes. I maintained the property. I visited every chance I got. Selling it had never crossed my mind. Yet somehow a title company believed a sale was already in progress. I opened my laptop and searched through every email account I owned. Nothing. No contracts. No notices. No messages from real estate agents. Nothing at all. Then I checked my voicemail. There were 2 messages from numbers I didn't recognize. Both mentioned paperwork. Both referenced a pending transaction. My pulse quickened. This wasn't a misunderstanding. Something was happening. Someone had convinced multiple people that my land was being sold. I wanted to believe there was a reasonable explanation. I wanted to believe it was a clerical error. But deep down, a terrible feeling had already begun to grow. Because there was only one person who had been asking unusual questions about the property recently. Only one person who seemed strangely interested in its value. My father, Thomas Carter. And as I stared at my phone that morning, I had no idea that the next few weeks would force me to choose between protecting my family's legacy and protecting my relationship with the man who raised me. After that phone call, I could not focus on anything else. I tried answering emails, tried finishing reports for work, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the same question. Why would anyone believe my land was for sale? By late afternoon, I gave up pretending to be productive and drove west toward Dawson County. The trip took a little over 3 hours, and the entire way there I felt a strange mix of anxiety and disbelief. Part of me still hoped there had been some harmless misunderstanding. The moment I turned onto the gravel road leading to the property, however, I felt something different. It was the same feeling I used to get before bad news arrived. The land stretched out before me exactly as I remembered. Endless open fields moved gently beneath the Nebraska wind. The creek still cut through the northern edge. The old oak trees still stood near the fence line. Nothing looked different, yet somehow everything felt different. I parked near the small farmhouse that had not been occupied in years and stepped outside. Whenever life became overwhelming, this place had always brought me peace. My grandmother used to call it our anchor. She believed every family needed one thing that reminded them where they came from. For her, this land was that thing. As I walked toward the porch, memories flooded back. I could still hear her voice telling stories about surviving difficult years, raising a family, and protecting what mattered most. She often told me that land was not valuable because of money. It was valuable because it carried history. Every acre held pieces of the people who came before us. That was why she chose me. At least that was what she told me during one of our last conversations together. I was 30 years old at the time. We sat on this same porch watching the sunset. She took my hand and said, "Evelyn, some people see land and think about dollars. I see family. Promise me you will remember the difference." I promised. 8 years later, I had never forgotten. My father had been present when the will was read. He never challenged it. He never complained. In fact, he told everyone my grandmother had made the right decision. That was one reason the situation made no sense. For years he appeared completely supportive. He occasionally asked how the property was doing. Sometimes he offered suggestions about leasing portions of the farmland. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. Yet as I stood there looking across those 160 acres, I remembered several conversations from the previous year. At the time, they seemed harmless. Now they sounded different. He had asked whether I planned to keep the property forever. He had asked whether I realized how much developers might pay for land in that area. He had even mentioned that holding and used property could become a burden. Back then, I brushed those comments aside. I assumed he was making conversation. Now I wondered if those questions had been leading somewhere. I spent nearly an hour walking the property before heading into town. There was a small diner my family had visited for decades. The owner, Frank, knew practically everyone in the county. As soon as I walked in, he recognized me. We exchanged a few pleasantries before he casually asked a question that immediately made my stomach tighten. "So, when is the big sale supposed to happen?" I froze. "What sale?" Frank looked confused. "The land. Folks have been talking about it for weeks." My pulse quickened. Weeks. Not days. Weeks. Before I could stop myself, I asked where he had heard that. Frank shrugged. "People saw investors out there. They have been driving around the property with your dad." For a moment, I could not speak. The sounds of the diner seemed to disappear around me. Investors? My dad? The same words kept echoing inside my head. Because if what Frank was saying was true, then this was no clerical error. Someone had been showing my property to potential buyers long before that phone call ever reached me. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept replaying the conversation at the diner. Investors had been visiting the property. My father had been showing them around. The more I thought about it, the less I could convince myself there was an innocent explanation. Early the next morning, I began looking for answers. I started with public records. Most people do not realize how much information can be accessed online if you know where to look. I searched county filings, property records, and development proposals. At first, nothing stood out. Then I noticed a recent zoning inquiry connected to land parcels adjacent to mine. A development company called Prairie Horizon Development had submitted requests involving several hundred acres in the area. My property sat right in the middle of the land they appeared interested in acquiring. My stomach tightened. That could have been a coincidence, but it did not feel like one. I continued digging. After nearly 2 hours, I found something else. A local business journal had published an article discussing a potential residential expansion project west of town. The article mentioned that company representatives had been meeting with local landowners for months. Months. That word hit me hard. If negotiations had truly been happening for months, then this situation had started long before that strange phone call reached me. I decided to drive back to the county offices. I wanted information directly from the source rather than relying on internet searches. The clerk who helped me was polite but cautious. She explained that no ownership transfer had been recorded, which offered a small amount of relief. However, she also confirmed that inquiries regarding the property had been made by individuals claiming to represent family interests connected to the land. Family interests. The phrase lingered in my mind as I walked back to my car. My father had spent his entire life in that county. People knew him. They trusted him. If he presented himself as someone acting on behalf of the family, very few people would question it. Later that afternoon, I stopped by the property again. While driving along the southern fence line, I noticed fresh tire tracks cutting through a section of grass near the access road. That alone was not unusual, but it matched what Frank had told me. People had been visiting. Standing there, I suddenly remembered another conversation from several months earlier. My father had called me out of the blue and asked whether I still had copies of my grandmother's estate documents. At the time, I thought he was helping organize old family paperwork. Now the memory felt different. Every new detail seemed to connect to something I had previously ignored. By evening, I decided to speak with a few neighboring landowners. Most were friendly, and several recognized me immediately. One rancher named Bill shared information that made my heart sink even further. He told me he had attended a lunch meeting earlier in the year where developers discussed future plans for the area. According to Bill, my father was present. Not only was he present, he spoke confidently about how the remaining land acquisitions were progressing. Bill even assumed I already knew about it. I forced a smile and thanked him before returning to my vehicle. The steering wheel felt cold beneath my hands as I sat there processing everything. The evidence was no longer pointing in one direction by accident. It was forming a pattern. Meetings, investors, development plans, questions about estate documents, discussions about land acquisitions. And at the center of every conversation stood the same person, my father. Yet one piece still made no sense. Even if he wanted the property sold, he could not legally sell land he did not own. There had to be something else. Some document, some representation, some claim being made behind closed doors. As the sun disappeared behind the horizon, I made a decision. Guessing was no longer enough. The next morning, I would hire an attorney and find out exactly what had been happening in my name. The next morning, I called a law office in Lincoln that specialized in property and estate matters. By noon, I was sitting across from an attorney named Daniel Harper. He was calm, methodical, and unlike everyone else I had spoken with, he did not seem interested in assumptions. He wanted facts. I explained everything from the unexpected phone call to the conversations at the diner and the reports of investors touring the property. He listened carefully and took notes without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and asked a simple question. Has anyone ever had legal authority to act on your behalf regarding this property? No, I answered immediately. Never. He nodded. Then the first thing we need to do is find out exactly what documents other parties believe exist. Within hours, his office began making inquiries. Because several organizations had already been involved in the proposed transaction, there was a paper trail somewhere. We just needed to locate it. The waiting was unbearable. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart jumped. By late afternoon, Daniel called and asked me to come back to his office. The tone of his voice told me this was important. When I arrived, several documents were spread across the conference table. He pointed toward a folder. I think we found the source of the problem. I sat down and looked through the paperwork. At first glance, it seemed like standard transaction material. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. My name appeared repeatedly in discussions regarding the property. Not my actual signature, but references to me. References suggesting that certain parties believed someone was communicating on my behalf. Daniel slid another document toward me. Take a look at this section. I read it twice before the meaning fully registered. The file indicated that a representative of family interests had been coordinating discussions regarding the property and potential sale terms. While the language was careful, it created the impression that authority existed where none actually did. Who submitted this? I asked. Daniel tapped another page. There it was. Thomas Carter. My father's name. Seeing it in black and white felt different from hearing rumors. Rumors still leave room for doubt. Documents do not. I stared at the page for several seconds. Part of me wanted to believe there was still an explanation. Perhaps he thought he was helping. Perhaps he believed he was opening discussions rather than pursuing an actual sale. But another part of me could no longer ignore the pattern. Every new discovery pointed in the same direction. Daniel continued reviewing the file. There is something else you need to see. He handed me a summary of communications involving various parties connected to the transaction. Several statements described expectations that ownership issues would be resolved before closing. Ownership issues. The phrase immediately caught my attention. What does that mean? I asked. It means someone knew there were legal questions, Daniel replied. The concerning part is that discussions appear to have progressed anyway. The room suddenly felt smaller. I realized this situation had moved much further than I originally imagined. This was not a casual conversation between neighbors. This was an organized effort involving developers, representatives, and transaction professionals. Somehow my property had become part of a process I never approved. Then Daniel pointed to one final detail. A tentative closing timeline had already been discussed. Not next year, not months away. Soon, very soon. My pulse quickened. Had that first phone call never happened, I might have remained completely unaware until the process advanced even further. Daniel folded his hands on the table. Evelyn, the good news is that ownership records remain in your name. The bad news is that enough activity has occurred that we need to act immediately. I looked down at the documents one last time. My father's name appeared again and again throughout the file. For the first time since this nightmare began, I stopped asking whether he was involved. The real question now was why. For 2 days, I avoided calling my father. Part of me wanted more evidence before confronting him. Another part of me was afraid of what he might say. Growing up, Thomas Carter had always been the person I turned to when something went wrong. He taught me how to drive. He helped me through college applications. When my grandmother passed away, he was the one who stood beside me at the funeral and told me everything would be all right. Those memories made it difficult to reconcile the man I knew with the documents spread across Daniel Harper's conference table. Yet every path led back to him. Eventually, I realized there was no point delaying the conversation. On Thursday evening, I called him. He answered on the second ring. His voice sounded normal, almost cheerful. We exchanged small talk for less than a minute before I got to the point. Dad, I need to ask you something about Grandma's land. There was a brief pause. What about it? Have you been meeting with developers? Silence followed. Not confusion, not surprise. Silence. That silence told me more than any explanation could have. Where did you hear that? He finally asked. My heart sank. It was not a denial. People have seen you showing the property. I have spoken with attorneys. I have seen documents. Another pause. Then he sighed. Evelyn, you are making this bigger than it needs to be. I gripped the phone tighter. Then explain it to me. He began speaking in the calm tone parents sometimes use when they believe their children are overreacting. He talked about opportunity. He talked about development. He talked about how much money the land could bring. What he never talked about was permission. Finally, I interrupted him. The property belongs to me. Legally, yes, he replied. But it has always been family land. The moment those words left his mouth, something shifted inside me. For days I had searched for misunderstandings. I had looked for mistakes, confusion, or miscommunication. Instead, I was hearing justification. Family land does not mean you get to make decisions for me, I said. I was trying to help you, he answered. You have no idea how much that property is worth right now. Then why was I never informed? His response came quickly, too quickly, because I knew you would say no before hearing the details. I stared at the wall in disbelief. There it was, the truth hidden beneath all the explanations. He had already decided what the outcome should be. My opinion had simply become an obstacle. The conversation grew increasingly difficult after that. I asked whether he had represented himself as someone acting on my behalf. He avoided giving a direct answer. I asked whether he had participated in negotiations. He admitted speaking with interested parties. I asked whether he understood that a closing timeline had already been discussed. Again, no direct answer. Every response felt carefully crafted to avoid responsibility while acknowledging just enough to move forward. Then he said something I will never forget. Your grandmother trusted me too, Evelyn. I know what she would have wanted. For several seconds, I could not speak. My grandmother had been very clear about her wishes. That was why she left the property to me. Hearing him use her memory to defend his actions felt like a second betrayal layered on top of the first. When I finally found my voice, it sounded calmer than I expected. No, Dad. What she wanted is written in her will. Another long silence followed. Neither of us spoke. In that moment, I understood something I had been resisting for days. This was not a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with one difficult conversation. My father genuinely believed he had the right to decide the future of property that was not his. And if he believed that, there was a very real chance he would continue moving forward unless someone stopped him. The morning after my conversation with my father, I met Daniel Harper again. This time, there was no uncertainty left in my mind. I was no longer trying to figure out whether something inappropriate had happened. I was focused on stopping it before it went any further. Daniel had already prepared several documents by the time I arrived. As he walked me through them, I realized how close the situation had come to becoming something much larger. Multiple parties had been operating under assumptions that needed to be corrected immediately. The first step was establishing a clear record that I had never authorized anyone to negotiate, represent, or discuss a sale on my behalf. It sounded simple, but Daniel explained that clarity matters. Once official notices are delivered, misunderstandings become much harder to claim. We spent the next hour reviewing ownership records, correspondence, and communication timelines. Every document reinforced the same reality. The land belonged to me. No transfer had occurred. No authority had been granted. No sale had been approved. Yet discussions had continued as though those facts were secondary details that would eventually work themselves out. Daniel sent formal notices to every major party involved. The title company received one. Representatives connected to the proposed transaction received another. The development company received one as well. Each notice made the same point. I was the sole owner, and no transaction could move forward without my direct participation and consent. By that afternoon, the first responses started arriving. Some were polite. Others sounded surprised. A few seemed genuinely concerned. One representative even admitted that they had believed family authorization. Issues were already being resolved internally. Hearing that only confirmed how far the assumptions had spread. What struck me most was that nobody seemed confused about who actually owned the property. The confusion centered around who was speaking for me. Someone had created enough confidence in that arrangement that people were comfortable proceeding. Daniel remained calm throughout the process. He reminded me repeatedly that facts matter more than emotions. Every time I felt overwhelmed, he directed my attention back to the documents. Ownership records, legal filings, written notices, objective evidence. Those things could not be argued away with family opinions or personal interpretations. Late that afternoon, Daniel received a phone call while I was still in his office. After listening for several minutes, he thanked the caller and ended the conversation. Then he looked at me and said something that immediately caught my attention. The closing timeline has been suspended. For a moment, I just stared at him. Suspended. He nodded. No one wants to proceed while ownership representation is being challenged. Relief washed over me so suddenly that I almost laughed. For days I had felt like I was chasing a moving train, afraid I would arrive one step too late. For the first time since that original phone call, everything seemed to stop. The process was no longer moving forward without me. The transaction had hit a wall. Yet even as relief settled in, another feeling took its place. Sadness. Because this victory did not feel like a victory. It felt like damage control. I had protected my property, but I could not stop thinking about the person who forced me into that position. On my drive home, I passed fields that looked remarkably similar to the ones my grandmother had loved. The late afternoon sun stretched across the horizon, painting everything gold. Normally, scenery like that would have calmed me. Instead, I kept replaying my father's words. He had never apologized. He had never acknowledged crossing a line. He simply believed he knew better. By the time I pulled into my driveway, one thing had become clear. The sale might be frozen, but the real conflict was far from over. Because stopping a transaction was one thing, confronting the consequences of broken trust was something entirely different. I thought the hardest part would be dealing with lawyers, paperwork, and developers. I was wrong. The hardest part began after word spread through the family that the transaction had been stopped. Within days, my phone started ringing. At first, I assumed relatives were calling to check on me or ask what had happened. Instead, most of them seemed interested in telling me what I should have done differently. My Aunt Carol was the first. She called on a Saturday morning and barely spent 30 seconds asking how I was before moving straight into her opinion. "Evelyn, your father was only trying to help." I stared at the phone in disbelief. Help by discussing the sale of property that does not belong to him? There was an awkward pause before she replied. "You know that is not what I mean." But I didn't know what she meant. She meant family loyalty. She meant looking the other way because the person involved happened to share my last name. Over the next week, similar conversations happened again and again. A cousin told me I should have handled everything privately. An uncle suggested that I was embarrassing the family by involving attorneys. Another relative insisted that I was being too emotional about a business decision. Every conversation left me feeling more isolated. What surprised me most was that very few people asked whether my father's actions had been appropriate. Instead, they focused on my response. Somehow the person who objected became the problem rather than the person who created the situation. One evening, I attended a family birthday dinner for a distant relative. I almost did not go, but I convinced myself that avoiding everyone would only make things worse. The moment I walked into the restaurant, I could feel the tension. Conversations softened. A few people looked away. Others offered polite smiles that did not reach their eyes. During dinner, nobody mentioned the situation directly, but it lingered over every conversation like a storm cloud. Then my cousin Mark finally broke the silence. "Do you really think all this was worth it?" he asked. Several people immediately became interested in their food. Nobody wanted to be involved, yet everyone wanted to hear the answer. I put down my fork. "What exactly is all this?" Mark shrugged. "The conflict, the lawyers, the family drama." I looked around the table. "You mean protecting property that legally belongs to me?" Nobody answered. That silence told me everything I needed to know. Many of them were uncomfortable with what had happened. They simply felt more uncomfortable confronting my father than questioning me. As the evening continued, I noticed a pattern. People kept describing the situation as a disagreement, a misunderstanding, a dispute between family members. Those words bothered me because they softened reality. This was not a disagreement about where to spend Thanksgiving or how to divide chores after a reunion. Someone had tried to make decisions involving property they did not own. Calling that a misunderstanding did not make it one. A few days later, my father left a voicemail. His message was brief. He said family members were upset. He said people were talking. He said things had gotten out of hand. What stood out was what he did not say. He never apologized. He never acknowledged my concerns. He never admitted crossing boundaries. The focus remained on the consequences rather than the choices that created them. By then, something inside me had changed. The pressure from relatives still hurt, but it no longer confused me. I began realizing that many people value peace more than truth. They would rather ignore uncomfortable facts than challenge familiar relationships. For years, I had believed family automatically meant support. Now I was learning a more difficult lesson. Sometimes the moment you stand up for yourself is the moment people reveal where their loyalties truly belong. Over the following month, the situation finally began moving toward a conclusion. The development company backed away from any involvement with my property. The title company updated its records and documented that no one other than me could authorize future transactions. Every loose end Daniel had identified was addressed one by one. On paper, the crisis was over. The land remained mine. The proposed transaction had collapsed. The legal questions had been resolved. Yet I felt no sense of celebration. Instead, I carried a quiet sadness that followed me everywhere. Winning had not restored what was lost. One afternoon, Daniel called to confirm that all outstanding issues had been cleared. "You are protected," he said. "If anyone attempts something similar in the future, there are safeguards in place." I thanked him and hung up. Then I sat alone in my living room staring at the blank television screen. Protected. It was a comforting word, but it came with a painful realization. The person I now needed protection from was someone I had trusted for my entire life. During those weeks, my father continued reaching out occasionally. Some messages were polite. Others sounded frustrated. None addressed the central issue. He spoke about family tension. He spoke about misunderstandings. He spoke about moving forward. What he never spoke about was accountability. Eventually, I understood that I could not force him to see the situation the way I did. I could not make him acknowledge boundaries he did not believe existed. The only thing I could control was my own response. That realization led me to make one of the most difficult decisions of my life. I began creating distance. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, out of necessity. I stopped sharing personal information. I stopped discussing financial matters. I stopped answering every phone call. Conversations became shorter and less frequent. Family gatherings became rare. For a while, I questioned myself constantly. Was I being too harsh? Was I overreacting? Those doubts lingered until one evening when I found myself rereading my grandmother's will. I had not looked at it in years. As I sat at my kitchen table, I carefully read every page. Her intentions were unmistakably clear. She trusted me with the responsibility of preserving the property. She trusted me to make decisions regarding its future. Nobody else. That simple fact brought unexpected peace. I realized my decision was not about punishing my father. It was about honoring the responsibility she gave me. A few days later, my father called again. This time, I answered. The conversation remained civil. We talked briefly about weather, mutual acquaintances, and everyday life. Then he said something that confirmed I had made the right choice. I still think this whole thing could have been handled differently. I listened quietly. Maybe, I replied, but it should have started with honesty. Silence followed. Neither of us argued. Neither of us raised our voice. There was simply nothing left to debate. The facts had already spoken for themselves. When the call ended, I felt an unexpected sense of clarity. Sometimes people imagine major life decisions happen in dramatic moments filled with emotion. For me, it happened during that quiet conversation. That was when I accepted reality. The relationship I once had with my father no longer existed. Perhaps someday things would improve. Perhaps they would not. But rebuilding trust requires acknowledgement, and acknowledgement was something he still refused to offer. So I made my final decision. I would maintain firm boundaries. I would protect my property, my finances, and my peace of mind. Most importantly, I would stop sacrificing my own well-being in exchange for the appearance of family harmony. The transaction was over. The legal battle never became necessary. The land was safe. Now it was time to protect something equally important, myself. 1 year later, I stood in the middle of the property on a cool autumn morning. The sky stretched endlessly above the Nebraska plains, and the wind moved through the tall grass with the same gentle rhythm I remembered from childhood. Some things had changed over the previous 12 months. Others had remained exactly the same. The oak trees still stood near the creek. The gravel road still wound across the fields. The land itself seemed completely unaware of the conflict that had nearly altered its future. I had come alone that morning. No lawyers, no paperwork, no phone calls. Just me and the place my grandmother loved. As I walked along the edge of the creek, I found myself thinking about everything that had happened. When the ordeal first began, I believed the greatest risk was losing the property. Looking back, I realized that fear had blinded me to a deeper truth. The real loss would have been losing my ability to trust my own judgment. Throughout the process, countless people had encouraged me to ignore my instincts. Some said I should stay quiet. Others said I should avoid conflict. Several insisted I should simply accept what happened for the sake of family peace. If I had listened, I would have spent the rest of my life wondering why I abandoned my own boundaries. Instead, I chose something far more difficult. I chose to believe what the evidence showed me, even when I did not want it to be true. My relationship with my father never fully recovered. We occasionally exchanged brief messages during holidays and family milestones, but the closeness we once shared never returned. At first, that reality felt heartbreaking. Over time, however, I began viewing it differently. Some relationships survive hardship because both people are willing to confront uncomfortable truths. Others remain stuck because one person refuses to acknowledge them. I could not control which path my father chose. I could only control my own. During the year that followed, I focused on building a life that felt peaceful again. I spent more time with friends who respected boundaries. I traveled. I invested in projects that mattered to me. Most importantly, I stopped measuring my worth by other people's approval. That lesson changed everything. One afternoon, several months earlier, I had found an old photograph tucked inside a family album. It showed my grandmother standing near the farmhouse decades ago. She was smiling into the camera while holding a gardening hat in one hand. Looking at that picture, I suddenly remembered something she used to say. Character is revealed when protecting what matters becomes inconvenient. At the time, I thought she was talking about hard work. Now I understood she was talking about integrity. As I continued walking across the property, I realized that the land represented something much larger than acreage or market value. It represented responsibility. It represented promises. It represented the courage to stand firm when standing firm would disappoint people you love. Eventually, I reached the porch where my grandmother and I once watched sunsets together. I sat down and looked across the field stretching toward the horizon. The same horizon I had stared at countless times throughout my life. For the first time in over a year, I felt completely at peace. Not because everything had turned out perfectly, not because the damage had disappeared, but because I had stopped carrying guilt for decisions that were necessary. The property remained exactly where it belonged. The future remained mine to decide. And perhaps the most important lesson of all was this. Sometimes protecting what matters will cost you a relationship, but losing a relationship is far less painful than losing yourself. As the morning sun rose higher over the Nebraska fields, I smiled quietly and looked out across the land my grandmother entrusted to me, knowing that I had finally honored both her faith in me and my faith in myself.